All right, so today we're going to be tackling this pretty big decision by the U.S. to leave the World Health Organization.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
And luckily, we've got some great sources here, a local piece from the Spokesman Review, and then some broader perspectives, like we've got one from the University of Michigan and Time Magazine, too.
It's really interesting to see, a global issue like this viewed from both those lenses, right?
It's like those local and global perspectives kind of meet.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I find so intriguing about this whole thing. I mean, these sources, they raise some really thought-provoking questions like, is this going to make us more vulnerable to the next pandemic? Could this shift the balance of power in global health, particularly when it comes to China? And what does it all mean for everyday people right here in Spokane? Like you and me.
Yeah, for sure. I think before we get too far ahead of ourselves, though, we need to make sure everyone has a clear understanding of what the WHO is and maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah. Okay. So back to basics. A few of the articles dive into the history and the role of the WHO.
Right. So we're talking about an agency of the United Nations founded back in 1948, and the U.S. was actually a founding member. The goal was, and still is, to coordinate global health responses.
So kind of like a health traffic controller for the whole planet.
Yeah, you could think of it that way, for sure. The articles talk about coordinating responses to outbreaks, gathering disease data globally, all that kind of stuff.
But I think what's interesting, and what you're getting at before, is that they don't actually have any enforcement power.
Right. It's more like they're a highly respected advisor. They rely on collaboration and information sharing between all the different member countries.
Okay, so that makes sense. Which also means that when a country like the U.S. steps back, it's not just about the money or the resources that they're taking away. It's also about potentially disrupting that whole system of cooperation that the WHO relies on.
Exactly. And that's what makes that quote from Tony Smith in the Spokesman Review so powerful. He said, and paraphrasing a bit here, diseases don't care about borders. So without global intelligence, we're essentially flying blind.
That's a scary thought, right?
It is. And the University of Michigan article really drove that point home. They talked about how crucial that global data sharing is, especially for a country like the U.S., because we rely on that information to figure out how to respond to health threats.
And that's where the Spokane angle gets really interesting, too. The Spokesman Review quoted the Spokane Regional Health District, and they were basically saying no immediate changes are expected. But they were really clear about how much they rely on WHO data. And the long-term effects are still unknown. So it makes you think, how much do we depend on something that we might not even be aware of?
Right. And that's a great example of how these big global decisions can have very real impacts on local communities.
Absolutely.
I mean, just look at the flu vaccine. The Spokesman Review used that as a really great example of how the WHO's work impacts something that we all deal with every single year.
Yeah, I remember that. I thought that was a good point.
So flu season starts in the southern hemisphere usually, and then it kind of makes its way north. And the WHO, they're the ones that facilitate the sharing of data between those countries about what flu strains are going around.
Oh, that's right. So we know what to put in our flu vaccines.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So without that data, our flu shots might not be as effective.
That makes you think twice about the WHO's role. I mean, who wants a less effective flu shot?
It really highlights how interconnected global health is. What might seem like a distant issue happening on the other side of the world can directly affect you right here at home.
Right. It's all connected.
Exactly.
Now, of course, there's always two sides to every story. And the Time article brought up the cost of U.S. membership, which is pretty substantial, between $100 and $122 million annually. And that's not even including all the voluntary contributions. So it does make you wonder if that money could be better spent elsewhere.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid question. And the article presents some of the arguments that the Trump administration made when they decided to leave the WHO. One of the key arguments was this idea that the WHO's payment structure puts an unfair burden on the U.S., especially when you compare us to a country like China.
They pointed out that China has a similar assessment from the WHO, even though their population is 4 times larger.
Yeah, exactly. And there were also concerns about the effectiveness of the WHO and their ability to stay independent from political influence, especially after everything that happened with COVID-19.
Yeah, the Time article mentioned the criticism of the WHO's initial response to the outbreak and the investigations into the virus's origins.
It's important to acknowledge those criticisms and have those conversations.
But even with those criticisms, the Time article pointed out that some critics of the WHO don't necessarily think that withdrawing funding is the right solution.
Right. Some argue that taking away funding might actually make it harder for the WHO to make the reforms and improvements that people are asking for.
That's an interesting point. It's kind of like saying, you're not doing a good enough job, so I'm going to take away your resources.
Right? Doesn't really make sense if you want to see things improve.
So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the potential long-term consequences if the U.S. does leave the WHO. What could that mean not just for the world, but specifically for us here in the U.S.?
Well, the Time article didn't hold back on painting a pretty concerning picture. They suggested that the U.S. could become more vulnerable to infectious disease outbreaks in the future.
Because we'd lose access to that early warning system and the global data sharing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be a part of those crucial communication channels where countries share critical information about emerging health threats.
It's like losing our eyes and ears in the global health landscape.
And it's not just about emerging diseases either. They also talked about the potential impact on something as familiar as the flu.
Right. Without that WHO data on flu strains, our vaccines might not be as effective. And that could lead to more hospitalizations and even deaths from the flu, especially among people who are already vulnerable.
It's definitely a sobering thought. And it emphasizes how deeply interconnected global health really is. What might seem like a problem in a far-off country can very quickly become a threat right here at home.
Wow. This has been a lot to take in. I'm feeling a lot more informed, but also a bit overwhelmed by how complex it all is. It's like we're on the edge of something big, but we can't quite see what's on the other side.
Yeah, it's definitely a pivotal moment. As we keep going with this deep dive, we'll unpack some more of those potential implications and really explore the arguments for and against the U.S. leaving the WHO.
Sounds good. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll jump right back in.
Okay, so before the break, we were talking about some of the downsides of the U.S. potentially leaving the WHO. But I think it's only fair to look at the other side of the argument, too.
Okay.
Absolutely. There are definitely arguments in favor of leaving. And the Time article did a good job of laying those out. A lot of it comes down to the financial aspect.
Right. The Trump administration really emphasized that they felt like the U.S. was shouldering an unfair financial burden.
Yeah. They argued that the WHO's assessment system was basically unfair to the U.S., especially when you compare it to what a country like China contributes.
It's true that China has a much larger population, but they have a similar assessment level from the WHO.
Exactly. So the argument is that the U.S. is paying way more than its fair share.
And then there's the whole issue of the WHO's effectiveness and whether they can really operate independently from political influence.
Right, especially after the whole COVID-19 situation. There was a lot of criticism about how the WHO handled that.
Yeah, the Time article mentioned the criticism surrounding their initial response to the outbreak, and then also the investigations into the origins of the virus.
Right. Those are definitely valid concerns. And it's important to have those conversations about accountability and transparency.
But even with all of that, the Time article made a point of saying that some people who are critical of the WHO don't actually agree with the idea of completely pulling out and cutting off funding.
Yeah. They make the argument that withdrawing funding would actually hinder the WHO's ability to make the changes that people are asking for. It's kind of like if you're trying to fix a leaky faucet, but then you just completely turn off the water supply.
Right. It might stop the leaking, but it doesn't actually address the underlying problem.
Exactly. It's a Band-Aid solution, not a long-term fix.
So it seems like a more constructive approach might be to work from within the organization to try to implement those improvements.
Right. Instead of just cutting ties completely, maybe the focus should be on working collaboratively to address those concerns and really strengthen the WHO's effectiveness.
Okay, so let's do a little thought experiment here. Let's say hypothetically that the U.S. does leave the WHO. What could the long-term consequences be? Not just globally, but for the U.S. specifically.
Well, the Time article paints a pretty stark picture. One of the biggest concerns is that the U.S. would become more vulnerable to future infectious disease outbreaks.
Because we'd lose access to that global network of information and early warning systems.
Exactly. We wouldn't be part of those crucial communication channels where countries share intel about emerging health threats.
So we'd basically be on our own, trying to figure things out without the benefit of global cooperation.
And the potential consequences go beyond just new diseases. They also talk about the impact it could have on something as basic as the flu.
Oh, right, because the WHO plays a big role in making sure our flu vaccines are effective.
Exactly. Without access to their data on circulating flu strains, it's possible that our vaccines wouldn't be as effective. And that could lead to more people getting sick, more hospitalizations, and even more deaths from influenza.
And that's not even considering the impact on more vulnerable populations like the elderly or people with compromised immune systems.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It is. It really underscores how interconnected we all are when it comes to health. what might seem like a distant problem on the other side of the world can very quickly become a very real threat right here at home.
Absolutely. We can't ignore that reality global cooperation is essential when it comes to addressing health challenges.
This whole conversation makes me think about the bigger picture. It feels like this decision about the WHO really boils down to a fundamental question about the U.S.'s role in the world. Are we going to be an active participant in global health initiatives, working collaboratively with other countries to address these shared challenges? Or are we going to take a step back and potentially risk our own health and security in the process?
It's a complex question, for sure. There are definitely valid arguments on both sides, but ultimately it's a question that we as a nation need to answer. What role do we want to play in shaping the future of global health?
It feels like we're at a really pivotal moment, facing a choice that could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the U.S., but for the whole world.
Right. And it's not just about the U.S. either. It's about recognizing that the U.S. has historically played a major role in global health, both in terms of funding and leadership. So if the U.S. does step back from that role, it creates a vacuum.
And the question is, who steps in to fill that vacuum?
Exactly. And a lot of our sources, including the Time article, brought up this idea of China potentially stepping in as a global health leader if the U.S. retreats.
That's a pretty big shift in the global landscape, and it raises a lot of questions.
For sure. I mean, will China's approach to global health be the same as the U.S.'s? Will they share the same values and priorities?
It's not just about who fills the void. It's about how they fill it.
Exactly. Will it be a smooth transition, or will we see a fragmentation of global health efforts? Will it make us less effective at responding to future pandemics and other health threats?
And what about organizations like the WHO? Can they really function effectively without the support of a major player like the U.S.?
These are all really important questions that we need to be thinking about. The landscape of global health is constantly evolving, and we need to be prepared to navigate these complexities.
So we've definitely painted a pretty complex and maybe even a little bit daunting picture here. But as we start to wrap up this deep dive, I'm wondering if there's any room for optimism. Could this situation, as challenging as it is, potentially lead to something positive?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think there is some potential for positive change to come out of this. It's possible that this decision could actually serve as a catalyst for some much-needed conversations and maybe even some innovation in the realm of global health.
So maybe it's a wake-up call of sorts.
Yeah, maybe it forces us to really reevaluate our priorities and our strategies and to really think critically about our commitment to working collaboratively on a global scale.
Instead of just focusing on the WHO, maybe it prompts us to think more broadly about global health security, to explore alternative models for international cooperation and collaboration.
Right. Maybe it pushes us to move beyond traditional institutions and come up with more agile and responsive approaches to global health governance.
I've heard people talk about health diplomacy as a potential solution. Could the situation create more opportunities for that?
It's definitely possible. Health diplomacy is all about using health as a way to build stronger relationships between nations and to foster cooperation, even when there are political or ideological differences.
So maybe this situation could highlight the importance of health as something that unites us all.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all share a fundamental desire to be healthy and to protect ourselves and our loved ones from disease and suffering. And that shared desire could be a powerful foundation for building stronger bridges of collaboration and cooperation in the global health arena.
It's kind of a hopeful thought, isn't it? That something that seems so divisive could actually lead to a more unified approach to global health.
It is. It speaks to the power of health as something that connects us all. Regardless of our nationality, our ethnicity, our political beliefs, we all have a stake in global health.
And that stake is only going to get bigger as the world becomes increasingly interconnected.
Absolutely. We're living in an age of globalization. Diseases can spread across borders so easily and so quickly. So it's more important than ever that we find global solutions to address these global problems.
And those solutions require cooperation, collaboration, and a shared commitment to working together for the benefit of everyone.
Exactly. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And ignoring that reality can have some pretty serious consequences.
It's crazy to think, right? Like this one decision could have so many ripple effects. It's like we're at this fork in the road and we have to choose which path to take. And each path leads to a completely different future for global health.
It really does feel that way, doesn't it? Like a defining moment. Right. And the path we choose will say a lot about how we view our place in the world. Are we going to embrace the fact that we're all interconnected when it comes to health? Or are we going to retreat and kind of isolate ourselves and potentially risk our own security and well-being in the process?
That's a pretty big question, huh?
Yeah, it is. And it's one that we can't really ignore. And I think it leads perfectly into that thought-provoking question from our outline, the one we wanted to leave our listeners with.
Oh, yeah, I like this one.
So if the U.S. does step back from its role as a leader in global health, who's going to step up and fill that void? And what does that mean for the future of pandemic preparedness? Not just for the U.S., but for everyone.
It's like all of a sudden the stakes are raised, right? It's not just about politics or budgets anymore. It's about our shared humanity and our responsibility to look out for each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've been talking about global health a lot, but it's important to remember that we're not talking about some abstract concept here. We're talking about real people's lives and the well-being of communities all around the world.
Right. It's easy to get lost in the big picture sometimes.
Right.
But ultimately, this is about real people who could be impacted by these decisions.
And it's about understanding that what happens in one part of the world can really affect everyone. A disease outbreak somewhere far away can quickly turn into a pandemic that threatens us all. That's just the reality of the world we live in now.
Yeah, this whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to that. I never really thought about how much we depend on global cooperation to keep us safe from these kinds of threats.
It's easy to take it for granted, isn't it? But the truth is, we're all connected. And we need to work together if we want to build a healthier and safer future for everyone.
I think that's a really important message to leave our listeners with. We can't afford to just sit back and hope things work out. We all have a role to play in making sure global health is a priority.
Absolutely. Whether it's staying informed about these issues or engaging in conversations about them or advocating for policies that support global cooperation, even just making healthy choices in our own lives can make a difference.
So yeah, it's a complex issue with a lot of uncertainty, but it's not all doom and gloom. There's still hope for positive change if we're willing to work for it.
Exactly. We have the opportunity to learn from this situation and to come up with new and innovative solutions to these global challenges.
And that's a pretty exciting thought, right? That maybe this could be a turning point where we start to take global health even more seriously and really commit to working together to protect everyone.
I like that. A turning point. It's a chance to step up and be leaders in global health, to show the world that we're committed to working together to build a healthier and more secure future for all.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of global health. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I hope it's given you some food for thought. We'll be back next week with a whole new set of sources and a fresh perspective on another important issue. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, stay well.